Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Rick Dunham. I'm White House correspondent for Business Week magazine and president of the National Press Club. I'd like to welcome club members in the audience today and their guests as well as those of you watching on C-SPAN or listening on National Public Radio. For our broadcast audience, I'd like to explain that if you hear applause, it may be from guests and members of the general public who attend our lunches, not necessarily members of either the conservative media conspiracy or the liberal media conspiracy, depending on your point of view. The video archive of today's luncheon is provided by Connect Live and is available free to members of the National Press Club at the Press Club website, www.press.org. Press Club members also can access free transcripts of our luncheons on the website. Non-members may purchase the transcripts, audio tapes, or videotapes by calling 888-343-1940. Before introducing our head table, I'd like to remind our audience of some of our future speakers. On Friday, February 18th, pianist Leon Fleischer will be our speaker. On February 22nd, Julie Gerberding, the director of the Centers for Disease Control, will tell me why I got the flu last week and why I still can't get a flu shot. And on Wednesday, March 9th, former U.S. Senator Sam Nunn, the co-chair and the CEO of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, will be our speaker. If you have any questions for our speaker, please write them on the cards provided at your table and pass them up to me, and I'll ask as many as time permits. I'd now like to introduce our head table guests and ask them to stand briefly when their names are called. Please hold your applause until all the head table guests are introduced. From your right, Will Lester, political reporter of Associated Press, who's working with me to put together a series of members-only briefings with top pollsters in the city. Greg Pierce, the inside politics columnist at Washington Times. Kathy Kiley, Washington correspondent for USA Today and chair of the National Press Club Scholarship Committee. Melissa Charbonneau, White House correspondent of CBN DC News Bureau, and a new member of the National Press Club. Thank you, Melissa. Lou Priebe, the head of Priebe PR, a National Press Club Silver Owl and member of the National Press Club Board of Governors. Mike Anthony, the chief of the CBN News Washington Bureau and guest of our speaker. Congressman Dick Armey, former House Majority Leader and someone I covered in my days at the Dallas Times-Herald for nearly 20 years. Now the co-chair of Freedom Works, also a guest of our speaker. On my right, we have Bill McCarran of U.S. Newswire, the chairman of the National Press Club Speakers Committee. Skipping over our speaker, Barb McLeod, the president of McLeod International Network and member of the Speakers Committee who organized today's luncheon. Thank you, Barb. Rob Allman, the director of CBN News and guest of our speaker. Jolene Blozis, digital print content manager of U.S. News and World Report. Jay Newton Small, congressional reporter for Bloomberg News. Danielle Irby, supervising senior editor of NPR, and Jonathan Allen, reporter for Congressional Quarterly and co-chair of our Lawmakers Committee. Our guest today, Pat Robertson, is the first of a series of influential National Press Club luncheon speakers who will discuss the most important public policy issues facing Americans today and the role of the media in covering them. Dr. Robertson has been a prominent figure in American culture for the past 4 decades. The mainstream media and the inside the Beltway pundit elite largely discovered him in 1988 when he both ran for the Republican presidential nomination and launched the Christian Coalition, but he's been a major figure in religion, broadcasting, education, and international business for far longer than that. Whether it's as president of the Christian Broadcasting Network, which he founded in 1960, or as on-air host of the 700 Club, one of the longest-running shows in television history, or as chancellor of Regent University, which he founded in 1977, or as president of Operation Blessing, a philanthropic organization that has helped more than 175 million people in 96 countries since 1978, most recently the victims of the Indian Ocean tsunami, or as president of the American Center for Law and Justice, which he founded in 1991, or as author of 15 books, including his latest, entitled Courting Disaster, How the Supreme Court is Usurping the Power of Congress and the American People, Pat Robertson clearly has remained a very busy man. But those of us who cover politics in Washington probably have spilled most of our ink on his role as founder of the Christian Coalition, a movement of social conservatives that profoundly reshaped American politics, and some have argued also helped pave the way for 2 consecutive George Bush presidential victories. Marion Gordon Robertson, better known as Pat, was born in Lexington, Virginia on March 22, 1930. His father, Willis, served in the U.S. House of Representatives and Senate for 34 years. His ancestors include Benjamin Harrison, signer of the Declaration of Independence, and 2 former U.S. presidents, William Henry Harrison and Tippecanoe's grandson, Benjamin. A graduate of Washington and Lee University, our speaker earned a law degree from Yale and a Master of Divinity degree from New York Theological Seminary in 1959. That November, he, his wife Dee Dee, and their family left New York and drove to Tidewater, Virginia, where he planned to buy a floundering UHF station, for those of us who remember UHF television. According to legend, he arrived with $70 in his pocket, raised the finances to buy the station, created the Christian Broadcasting Network, and got it on the air October 1st, 1961. It's fair to say that Pat Robertson was a revolutionary. CBN was the first Christian television network in the United States. He began broadcasting the first Christian talk show, the 700 Club, in 1966. In 1971, he became the first Christian satellite operator. He was in on the ground floor of cable TV, and again, back in the mid-'70s, those of you who remember the early days of cable, he and Ted Turner and HBO were the main producers of the content at that time. Today, CBN produces programming seen in 200 nations in some 70 languages. In 1990, our speaker founded International Family Entertainment, Inc., a publicly traded company which included the Family Channel and, for a time, the Ice Capades and Mary Tyler Moore Entertainment. IFE was sold in 1997 for $1.7 billion. With big numbers like that, it's no wonder that publications like mine, Business Week, have written about Pat Robertson Incorporated. But in the mainstream media, there often has been more coverage of his political pronouncements than his business record, from critical comments about feminists to recounting conversation with President Bush before the Iraq War. Democrats and liberals have from time to time tried to demonize him as a conservative televangelist with an out-of-the-mainstream extremist agenda. In our speaker's view, America's news media has underreported or even misreported the role of Christian evangelicals in the political process. Today, Dr. Robertson will explain to us his view of the long-range policy hopes of the evangelical Christian community and tell us the big story the media has missed. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Pat Robertson.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to discuss with you 2 crucial subjects. First, the major global story that is being overlooked or downplayed by the Western press. And second, in light of the recent United States election last November, in which people of faith played a major role, what, therefore, do people of faith want for their country in the years ahead? First of all, the big story. For the past century, the world has been experiencing the most profound revival of the Christian religion in all of history. This has taken place alongside 2 world wars and the rise and fall of Soviet communism. But here are the startling facts. At present, Christianity is by far the world's largest religion, encompassing 1/3 of the world's population. Christianity has been and still is growing at a much faster rate than the population of the world. In 2005, there were 2,135,783,000 Christians in the world, but by 2025, 20 years from now, global Christianity will explode to 2,640,000,000 people. Of these, 798 million will be Pentecostals or charismatics, a group that could only count a few hundred adherents at the beginning of the 20th century. At present, there are an estimated 100 million Christians in mainland China, and 28,000 Chinese are coming to faith in Jesus Christ every single day. And according to David Aikman, former Time magazine bureau chief in Beijing, in 20 to 30 years, the Chinese population will be 25 to 30% Christian, making that country, according to Aikman, the world's largest Christian nation on earth, and at the same time no longer a threat to the global security of the United States of America. There was recently a tsunami wave in Southeast Asia that our organization sent relief supplies to, but a more profound Christian tidal wave is sweeping across the southern hemisphere and Asia. In 1900, there were 10 million Christians in Africa, representing 10% of the population. Today, there are 360 million Christians in Africa, representing just under half of the total population of that continent. According to Penn State University distinguished Professor Philip Jenkins, author of a landmark book, The Next Christendom, The Coming of Global Christianity, the greatest movement of the past century was not communism or capitalism. Jenkins says, do the math, and the winner is spirit-filled Christianity known as Pentecostalism. The growth of Christianity has taken place in the southern hemisphere and Asia outside of the radar of most Western media. The new Christianity represents a return to the Bible, to a faith in a supernatural Jesus who saves from sin, heals diseases, and overcomes the power of evil. While the American media is fixated on priestly sex abuse and homosexual marriages, the real story is on simple faith and supernatural power literally exploding around the world. 260 million Christians now live in North America, but 480 million live in South America, 360 million live in Africa, and 313 million live in Asia. By 2025, again just 20 years from now, an estimated 640 million Christians will live in Asia, 633 million in Africa, 460 million in Latin America, and that is 67% of the world's expected 2.6 billion Christians will come from what is now called the Global South. Now there are more Presbyterians who worship in Ghana than in Scotland. More Anglicans worship in Nigeria than in Britain. These Christians from the Global South cannot relate to the watered-down religion of their fellow religionists in the northern liberal churches. And for example, in the worldwide Anglican communion, on the one hand, there is a growing movement among the many churches overseas to brand the American Episcopal Church as apostate. And on the other hand, American Episcopal churches and dioceses are placing themselves under biblically oriented Anglican prelates from Singapore, Rwanda, and Uganda. The experience of the Christian Broadcasting Network, which I head, confirms the statistical findings of Professor Jenkins and the findings of the Status of Global Mission 2005, published by the International Bulletin of Missionary Research, and the findings of the Global Survey of World Missions, compiled by Professor David Barrett, who is editor of World Christian Encyclopedia. My organization broadcasts, it was mentioned, in 200 countries in many, many languages. And since 1990, our in-depth statistical surveys show that an incredible 369 million people worldwide have professed faith in Jesus Christ through our broadcasts. Of note are the 14 million handwritten letters that have been received in our office in Kiev in the Ukraine from all over the former Soviet Union, now called the Commonwealth of Independent States. There have been huge responses in Nigeria, Indonesia, the Philippines, Central and South America. And another interesting side note to the spiritual revival are the increasing numbers of Muslims in Pakistan, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Yemen, Egypt, and North Africa who report that they have received supernatural dreams in which Jesus Christ appears to them. Our CBN is planning to distribute a television documentary dramatizing these remarkable true life experiences. Our staff is discovering something else that has not been reported in the Western press, that throughout the Muslim world there is a profound spiritual hunger and a willingness of the people to learn more about Jesus Christ and the New Testament. Obviously, a wave of religious revival of the magnitude I've been describing has also washed ashore in the United States and in the process had a profound effect on our electoral politics. Exit surveys point to the key role people of faith played in last November's election. Post-election, I and others like me are being asked, what do you want for America? Well, I would be presumptuous in the extreme to say I speak for all or even most of the people of faith in the United States. However, as a former candidate for the presidency, the founder of a major Christian grassroots political organization, and a newscaster with 43 years' experience reporting the attitudes of religious people, I believe I'm qualified to offer a few suggestions. First and foremost, people of faith give assent to the truth of two verses found in the book of Proverbs of Solomon. One, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. And secondly, where there is no vision of God, the people run amok. At the drafting of the United States Constitution, John Adams remarked, and I quote, "We have not a government capable of restraining the animal passions of mankind. This Constitution was intended only for a moral and a religious people. It is totally inadequate for the government of any other." The Gallup organization recently released a study of the breadth and depth of religious commitment in the United States. This study, in development for 10 years, showed that 8 out of 10 Americans, that's 77% of all Americans, think that the health of our nation depends on the spiritual health of the country. What people of faith want above all else is an acknowledgement by government, by media, by educators, and especially the courts, that the greatness of our nation depends on its spiritual strength. The vast majority of the American people do not want their collective wisdom to be derided, ridiculed, and ignored by a tiny elite who are working tirelessly to strip our nation of its spiritual heritage and its moral foundation. To people of faith, their religion has deep significance. They do not want to be branded intellectually backward. You remember the Washington Post? Poor, uneducated, and easy to command, front page? Anyhow, they don't like that. They don't want to be branded intolerant or violative of the separation of church and state when they applaud the words of our first president, George Washington, spoken in his first inaugural address, and I quote, "It would be improper to omit in this first official act my fervent supplication to the Almighty Being who rules over the universe, who presides in the councils of the nation." Or the words of John Kennedy at his inauguration, and again I quote, "The rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God." Secondly, people of faith are passionate for freedom. In 1988, when I was a candidate, I drew gasps from some elites when I declared, quote, "The long-range goal of the foreign policy of the United States should be the elimination of communism throughout the world, especially the Soviet Union." We were opposed then to détente with the Soviet Union, and we are opposed in 2005 to a policy of silent acquiescence to tyrannical regimes like Iran and North Korea, which brutalizes their citizens and threatens the world with nuclear holocaust. And third, even as we are opposed to tyranny abroad, we also oppose tyranny at home. In my view, the greatest cause of domestic political discord is the usurpation of legislative and executive power by non-elected judges who are not content merely to adjudicate cases between litigants, but who attempt to determine from the bench matters given by the Constitution to the elected Congress and the President. Thomas Jefferson warned of the danger of ceding constitutional interpretation solely to the Supreme Court when he said, quote, "This is a very dangerous doctrine indeed, and one which will place us under the tyranny of an oligarchy." Regrettably, our current experience has proved the wisdom of Jefferson's warning. The cynicism of the justice was reflected at the beginning of the 20th century in the remarks by Charles Evans Hughes, who told a crowd at a civic luncheon in Elmira, New York, "We're under a Constitution, but the Constitution is whatever the judges say it is." That arrogance was evident in 1948 when the Supreme Court, with no authority whatsoever, declared that its decisions were on a par with the Constitution, acts of Congress, and treaties as the, quote, supreme law of the land. People of faith feel outraged and helpless as they watch unelected judges methodically crafting a constitution unknown to the founders, which permits the virtual extirpation from the public square of our time-honored affirmation of faith, then gives by judicial fiat federal constitutional protection beyond the reach of any elected body to abortion on demand, homosexuality, homosexual marriage, and blatant internet pornography. People of faith want the Congress to take back the power given it under the Constitution, to limit where necessary the appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, and follow clear constitutional guidelines for the confirmation of federal judges. The Senate Republicans have the votes to force up or down votes for the confirmation of the president's judicial appointments. Majority vote, not the filibuster, is the American way. The defeat of the former minority leader of the Senate should send a clear message that obstructionism, especially when it concerns the confirmation of judges, does not sit well with American voters. Number 4, people of faith want a change in educational policy. I speak on this subject as the president of a university whose graduate school of education is granting master's and doctoral degrees to hundreds of public school teachers, principals, and hopefully school superintendents. The work of my university notwithstanding, people of faith believe the public schools in many large cities are failing their children. They resent the influence of a powerful left-wing teachers' union in education. They deplore the lack of standards. They are offended by the ongoing vendetta against religious values and traditions in many public schools, and they do not want their children to be used as guinea pigs in far-out social experimentation in sexuality and so-called values clarification. People of faith support free enterprise and oppose monopoly. And since competition in business normally results in better service to consumers, we believe that competition and choice in education would bring our nation much better educational outcomes than it now enjoys. Number 5, I am the founder and chairman of an international relief organization, Operation Blessing, dedicated to helping the world's poor. In the United States, in addition to disaster relief, medical missions, and help for poor school children, our Hunger Strike Force will deliver this year over 100 million pounds of food to the poor in the inner cities of Appalachia. The overhead of Operation Blessing runs at 10% or less. Overhead for many government welfare programs runs, I've been told, as high as 70%. People of faith care deeply about helping the poor. Experience shows that the good done by faith-based organizations is beyond calculation, because they're able to serve not only the physical needs of the poor, but their spiritual needs as well. And we applaud the President's faith-based initiative. We just want to see a little more action in that regard from the executive branch and the Congress. Number 6, time does not permit a discussion of our strong support for tax reform or tort reform. But I do wish to emphasize one final agenda item. In my opinion, and those of many who agree with me, it is unlawful and sinful for trustees to steal from trust funds. And it is even more sinful for one generation to spend beyond its means and send the bill to its children and grandchildren. We believe that in the conduct of our personal lives, we're obligated to live within our means while saving enough to provide for the future of our children. We deplore the unbelievable fiscal excesses of elected representatives of both major political parties and their seeming inability to make the simple adjustments necessary to bring the federal budget into balance. Only Almighty God has the unlimited resources necessary to care for all people. When any government attempts to play the role of God in the lives of its citizens, it will ultimately bankrupt itself. People of faith applaud the efforts of the President to foster in our nation free enterprise, individual initiative, and an ownership society free from the intrusion and whims of big government. And in closing, I want to say that people of faith thank Almighty God for the privilege of living in this great nation and are proud to contribute their part to building a successful and prosperous future for all Americans. Thank you for this privilege of being with you. God bless you, and God bless America.
Great, thank you very much. We have a large number of questions ranging everywhere from politics to theology. So let me start with what you've just been talking about, the issue agenda. From your standpoint, what would you say are the top 3 moral issues that you would like to see addressed in President Bush's second term?
You know, when they say, where do you put a restaurant? It's location, location, location. For me, it's judges, judges, and judges. I think the crying need is a reform of our federal judiciary that has gotten arrogant and out of control. And I think most of the moral problems that we are facing, they're individual lives, but I do think the regulation of them should be in the hands of elected representatives that are responsible to the people and not unelected judges that are responsible essentially to nobody.
That leads into the next question. Someone in the audience asked if you believe that Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Arlen Specter will make it possible to do what you would like to see done with the Supreme Court.
Ha ha. Arlen was a year behind me in law school, and I hope I've taught him well. But anyhow, we talked before his confirmation as chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and I believe he's assured people that he talked to, as well as Senator Frist, that he will not oppose what's called the nuclear option or the constitutional option of limiting debate if it's necessary. Senator Frist said he doesn't think it's necessary, but Senator Specter has said clearly that he will not be a roadblock to the president's nominees for court. So I trust him and I believe what he said.
If we head toward that nuclear option on Capitol Hill, do you think it would be worth it to win the battle over the judges, even if it meant sacrificing some of the other presidential priorities like Social Security reform, if everything got caught up in the battle over judges?
I don't think that it's either or. I think that the president has already put forth several judges, like Priscilla Owens and William Pryor and other outstanding judicial candidates. And these people have already been cleared by the Judiciary Committee. The American way, in all seriousness, is a vote. The American people want a vote. And, you know, the filibuster is a Dutch term, which means to capture a ship at sea by pirates. And I don't know if the Democrats like to think of themselves as pirates, but the filibuster was used when my father was in the Senate to block civil rights legislation. And it is amazing that those who claim to be liberal are now taking that particular weapon to keep majority vote from taking place. There's nothing in the Constitution that says we need 60 votes to confirm. The Senate is supposed to have advice and consent, and advice and consent at most needs a positive vote. It doesn't mean 60 votes. And I believe Senator Frist is ready. I don't think that'll block any other legislation, but it's a simple point of order. And according to the Constitution, the Senate is in charge of its own rules. There is no appeal from a majority of the Senate who votes in a particular rule-making procedure. We were hoping they'd bring it up at the first of the term. They'd elected not to do it, but the next parliamentary procedure will be that there'll be a point of order, and at that point, a simple majority rule will be in effect. But again, a judge has got to get 51 votes, so there may be 4 or 5 Republicans who don't like him or her, and they won't vote for him. So I mean, that's the fair way of doing it, and I don't think that'll block any of the other initiatives of the president.
There's been a lot of talk of litmus tests and judges. During the presidential campaign, Republicans accused John Kerry of having a litmus test on abortion. Do you think litmus tests exist? Do you think it's a good idea? Do you think there should be a litmus test and any judge the president nominates should be pro-life?
If I was president, of course, if you remember, George Bush won in '88, not me, so I'm not president. But were I president, I would not ask for a litmus test on abortion. If I was interviewing a judicial candidate, what I'd want to know is his view on the Constitution. What I want to know is his respect for the Constitution. Do you respect the Constitution as the supreme law of the land? Do you respect the Constitution? You know, the guys swear an oath to defend and uphold the Constitution. They don't swear an oath to defend the United States. It's the Constitution. And I think I would want judges who would defend the Constitution, not rewrite it. And that's what's been going on, the sociological interpretation of the law. It means that it's a malleable document that can be changed according to the whims of any group of judges who happen to be in the majority. I wouldn't want that. And I think that it's not a question of how do you stand on abortion. Frankly, I don't think abortion should ever have been federalized. This business about a penumbra, you know, I went to Yale, and Justice Douglas was a Yale professor, so you see how far out they get. But in any event, this penumbra business in the 14th Amendment is nonsense. There are no penumbras, but he found one. And so judicial scholars talk about all the emanations in the penumbras. Nonsense. What does the word of the 14th Amendment say? What does the text say? That's what you'd want as the judge. You'd interpret the text. Don't talk to me about penumbras and make up things that don't exist in order to justify your own predilections. So litmus test, I don't see is necessary. Adherence to the true meaning and intention of the Constitution and the intention of the framers and those who have drafted amendments, that to me is crucial.
Someone in our audience asks, what's wrong with unelected judges? The President and Congress didn't desegregate the nation's public schools. It was a federal court which stood up against such discrimination. Do you believe that elected judges would have done that?
I don't particularly want to elect judges. I don't think that's the answer. I think the Constitution says how they get put in office. They get appointed by the President, confirmed by the Senate. That's fine. I don't want them elected because look at the corruption that can take place when the lawyers can go in and bring boodles of money into the court and pay off judges. I don't want that. But what I do want is a respect to what is in the Constitution. And you read the Constitution, the power is clearly placed in the hands of the legislature. You look at the number of words, the number of lines dealing with the legislature, it outnumbers everything else. It's almost like the judiciary is an afterthought. And Hamilton thought that the judiciary was going to be the weakest branch of government because they couldn't raise taxes. They couldn't write any laws to hurt anybody, and they had no armed forces. So they thought they were weak. But over the years, with John Marshall and others, they have morphed into a super legislature that is controlling Congress. And it's time for Congress to take back its power. The Constitution says that the Congress can set up all the inferior courts to the Supreme Court and grant the appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. And I just want Congress to be Congress. Dick Armey's here. I mean, tell them to stand up. Where are you? Well, I mean, stand up and be the Congress. Really? Yes? All right, go ahead.
And speaking of Congress standing up, we have several questions about Social Security and the debate going on Capitol Hill right now. Let me throw two out at once. One person wants to know if you were suggesting that the federal government is playing God when it strengthens the Social Security system on which so many elderly citizens depend. And another question, what do Republican leaders have to do to win the support of religious conservatives for a plan to retool Social Security?
If they have a little intestinal fortitude and a big dose of testosterone, they've got our support. I just think that Folks, we're facing a demographic crisis, not only the United States, but Japan and Europe, that down the road, in the not too many distant years, there will be at best 2 workers for every retiree, and before long, maybe 1 on 1. And this is going to be an insupportable problem. And I believe that we need to fix this system now and not punt it on to the next Congress and the next generation. When I was running for president, I advocated privatization of Social Security for younger workers. Now, that was '88, so here we are 17 years later, and we're still talking about it. But every year we wait, the problem gets worse, and the tax burden can hit up as high as 22%. I mentioned in my remarks that it is sinful to rob a trust fund. A lawyer or a banker who looted a trust fund would go to jail. Congress has systematically looted the Social Security Trust Fund virtually ever since it's been set up. It is a transfer payment. The amount going to workers goes to workers. The rest of it goes to make up the federal budget deficit. There is no trust fund. It is an IOU that's got to be paid one day by higher taxes. Now, if we can have younger workers begin to save for their own retirement, and it's more practical. I was reading an article by Gary Becker today in the Wall Street Journal who said, which is better, for the government to run the steel mills or for private enterprise to run the steel mills? He said, well, the answer is clearly private enterprise. Well, which is better to run the retirement system? Private enterprise or the federal government? And I think he said, you know, the answer is obviously private enterprise, and the enormous financial markets that we have in this country would be by far and away the best thing to give people individual initiative, let them help manage their own under clearly defined guidelines. So I'm in favor of vouchers, but at the same time, there's got to be discipline in the way we index Social Security payments. We cannot have Social Security payments tied into the increase in wages. It has to be tied to the Consumer Price Index. It'll make an enormous difference in how much gets paid. And furthermore, I mean, I'm 75 years old. I'm not about to retire. What's all this business about somebody 65 breaking down? I mean, this is nonsense. We are stronger and older, you know? And I think it's time we recognize that the age when people retire, it's no longer 60, and it's no longer 62, 63. It is much older because we're living longer, healthier, and more vigorous. And so some of that needs to be stretched out down the road. And it's just simple math. But it's an impending crisis that must be dealt with. So what does the president have to do to get my support? He's got it if he'll just get bold with it.
In your remarks, you mentioned Iran and North Korea. Would you support military action against those nations, or do you think the administration should work through world bodies like the UN to create change in those countries?
I think the United Nations is totally worthless. I know that's a bold statement, but whether it's relief or whatever it is an unwieldy bureaucracy. I've been to Rwanda and seen the tragedy there when Kofi Annan told the troops not to help those people being slaughtered, the Tutsis being slaughtered by the Hutus. I've seen some of these things, and I've seen the devastation that's been wrought in the Congo and these other places. So, I mean, it just isn't effective. How do you fix North Korea? It's a tiny little country. It spends a third of its total GDP on arms, and yet the GDP is minuscule compared to the United States. People are being starved to death. My feeling would be we ought to pressure South Korea as hard as we could, that's a client state of ours, and say you will open your doors to your fellow citizens from the north and give them sanctuary and not send them back to that pit up there of prison. And if the flood began, the regime of North Korea would collapse. But the South is telling us if you begin military action, Seoul is under the guns of all these North Korean missiles and weapons, and Seoul might well be wiped out. It's right close to the border. And so it's almost impossible for us to begin military action against North Korea. But I think the answer would be to pressure the South, and also to lean on the Chinese and say, listen, there's no reason that you don't let these people come into your country and then give them a trip down to the South and make the South receive them. We built up South Korea after the war. I was over there in the Marines in 1951, and South Korea was flat on its back, and it wouldn't be this big, prosperous economic engine if it wasn't for the United States' help. And I think we should demand them, you must deal with this situation and stop giving these North Koreans aid and comfort and nuclear supplies and all the other things. Now, number two about Iran, I believe the Iranian people, if given half the opportunity, will revolt against the mullahs. They hate the theocratic dictatorship that has been imposed on it. We need to do everything we can to stir up an indigenous revolution against that Iranian government. Iran is going to be very, very dangerous. They already have long-range missiles, and the head of the Mossad told me maybe 18 months they'll have nuclear weapons. They don't have them now, but they'll get them. And when they do, they will imperil Israel, and they can imperil Europe. We need to deal with it very quickly, and there's not a long amount of time left. But I would not favor military action against either one of them if it can be helped. But I think in the one case, I mean, we ought to look for both of them, a collapse of those oppressive regimes.
Iran and North Korea have been described as part of the axis of evil. The issue of freedom there is pretty obvious. What about countries like China and Saudi Arabia, where there's persecution of Christians, but they're frequently either trade partners or foreign policy allies of the United States? How do you deal with countries like that?
I made a number of trips to China. I see an enormous change in China over the last 20, 25 years. China is moving, with Deng Xiaoping, who said to be rich is glorious. They have one of the most vibrant economies in the world. And I think that we're going to see more and more openness of political freedom in China. And I think we need to encourage that. We don't need to necessarily acquiesce to oppression, but we need to encourage civil rights and encourage the Chinese as partners in trade in a free world. They're joining in the World Trade Organization, and I think they're going to have the Olympics over there soon, and we need to work with them to move toward freedom. I do believe that's coming. I don't think they can avoid that. As far as Saudi Arabia, the Wahhabis are a very fanatical, oppressive group, and they have had a stranglehold on the kingdom for ever since Ibn Saud and beyond. And it seems like to me that the United States might want to do something about that. I think the president has good relations with Abdullah and other of the leadership, and there has to be something to push the Saudis toward freedom. But it certainly doesn't exist now, although I understand that with the advent of so much terrorism in the kingdom, in Saudi Arabia, those people want to link up with us more and more to be defended from terrorism. It's a difficult thing, but I think with a certain amount of diplomacy we can make that happen. But I think we should lean on the Saudis. They have not been exactly our friends in this whole matter of terrorism, and I think it's time we put our interests above oil. Yeah.
Do you think the war in Iraq has helped win over followers of Islam to the United States or driven them away?
Say that. Do I?
I mean, overall, has the United States intervention in Iraq done more to help U.S. relations with Muslims around the world, or driven them further away from the United States?
I think the president has said what's true is that there beats in the heart of every human being a desire to be free. And when they see freedom, I think there's a spark that comes. We need also to remember that democracy and Islam do not coexist. And those who are passionate Islamists think that only God's laws applies. They want Sharia, they want the Quran as their standard, and they don't like, participatory democracy as such. That's what the Sunnis are saying in Iraq. I think it's too early to tell. I think the jury's still out on exactly what the long-range consequences are. So far, the signs seem to be favorable. But the president has bitten off a big, big bite. And I would support him in his desire for freedom, but how it's going to play out, I think it's too early to tell, but it does look like we're seeing encouraging signs out of that country, and maybe it will encourage others throughout the Islamic world to move for freedom.
As a religious broadcaster, what is your reaction to Al Jazeera television, and do you think that U.S. markets should have more access to their reports or less access?
I don't think we need Al Jazeera broadcasting the United States of America, frankly. It's a propaganda arm, and we try as journalists to be honest and objective, if I can quote Fox, fair and balanced. And anyhow, I don't think we should open our markets to Al Jazeera. It's a tool of oppression, and we don't need it.
Now we have a number of either theological questions or questions of religious nature. So I may scattershoot a little here, so I apologize in advance. You are using the term Pentecostalism. How do you distinguish that type of Christianity from evangelicals or charismatics? And what about mainline denominations?
I was, of course, quoting Professor Jenkins, who I don't know what his religion is. But the Pentecostals or charismatics believe in supernatural things like healing and the gifts of the Holy Spirit and a personal, extremely personal relationship with Jesus and with the Holy Spirit. The term charismatic is a Greek word charis, which means a grace gift, and the charismatic, or the charismata in the 12th chapter of 1 Corinthians deals with that something extra. You know, it said John Kennedy was charismatic and Lyndon Johnson wasn't charismatic, but it has to do with a certain charm that we attribute to politicians and people who are in the public eye. But it's that certain extra. The charis is the grace of God, and that's where the charismata are the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Within the broad context of evangelical has to do with euangelia, which is a Greek word meaning the proclamation of the good news. So the evangelicals are those who spend time preaching and are proclaiming the good news. So they overlap, but the Pentecostals or the charismatics believe in taking it a little bit further than the traditional evangelicals, but under some, in America, the National Association of Evangelicals and the National Religious Broadcasters includes charismatics, Pentecostals, and evangelicals all together. Mainline, these are the more traditional churches that came out of the Reformation, the Episcopal, the Methodist, the Presbyterian, etc.
In your view, should creationism be given equal weight as evolution in public schools?
Probably getting hot water on this one. There's stuff that has no scientific basis at all, has no scriptural basis at all, that's called creationism. And I'm not sure that ought to get taught just because it isn't scientific. But there is something called intelligent design, which is certainly appropriate, that students should realize that the complexity of this marvelous universe of ours deserves more attention. Let's just say it evolved. So where did it come from? And I think students need to know that indeed there are a vast number of people that believe this great universe was created by a supernatural being. And they can point to what is called intelligent design. There's just too much out there for it to be coincidental. If I could elaborate on that just a minute, I had a very eminent Israeli scientist who was talking about the Big Bang, and we believe right now the so-called cosmogony believes that the Big Bang took place probably 15 billion years ago. There was a great mass and it all blew apart, and out of that came the planets and the various solar systems, etc. He told me, after his study, and he was an eminent scholar, he said the universe was tuned for life. And he said, if the matter at the Big Bang 15 billion years ago had been off by 10 to the 120th power, in other words, essentially one atom, if it had been off by as much as one atom, we wouldn't have life on Earth. Because there's a certain amount of gravity that's in the universe, there's a certain amount of pressure, there's a certain amount of condition that is needed to bring forth life on Earth. And he said he and his colleagues have come to the conclusion that, quote, the universe was tuned for life. Well, I don't think you can just say Charles Darwin knew that because he went to the Galapagos Islands and saw some turtles. I just don't think that explains all of this, you know. And I think children ought to have an opportunity to hear eminent scientists talk about matters way beyond what you get in evolution. And to say that this is, you know, there's a lawsuit right now that prohibits schools from talking about intelligent design. Well, I mean, why? Why shouldn't students learn something like that? Okay.
And one more education question. In your opinion, what's the biggest difference between a higher education degree from Christian institutions like Regent University and secular institutions?
We think I would say ours is better. We integrate faith and learning, and it's an atmosphere of learning. We do not like political correctness. We do not like the stultifying influence of political correctness where people are afraid to open their mouths and say anything. We believe in free inquiry. We believe in open discussion. And we believe that God is the author of the universe, and things flow out from him. And so that there is an integration of faith and learning in our school. But at the same time, it doesn't keep us from having outstanding lawyers and members of legislatures and people working in various key positions in the world. But a secular education right now, in my opinion, higher education is in the grip of political correctness, which is a stultifying intellectual discipline that is destroying our best schools.
Question from a slightly different angle. You've stated that there were homosexual overtures in the children's program characters Teletubbies, and James Dobson now suggests the same thing with respect to SpongeBob children characters. What are you seeing in these characters that I don't see?
There's a guy who lives in Lynchburg, Virginia. He's a good little heavier than I am. His name's Falwell. He said that. I didn't say anything. I've never seen Teletubbies.
Well, that's a good answer. Now we'll change subjects. Do you support efforts to move Jewish settlements out of the West Bank? Do you support a Palestinian state? What are your expectations now with the changes in the Palestinian Authority?
All of us hope for peace. Peace is something that is earnestly desired by every thinking human being. I met a couple times with Yasser Arafat and had lengthy interviews, and he was a terrorist and a man who set up a police state down there and brutalized his people. I do not believe, frankly, that the state of Israel will be secure if there is a Palestinian state in its heart that has the ability to import weapons and rockets and maybe even chemicals and so forth without any supervision whatsoever. And I think it's dangerous. What Prime Minister Sharon has now advocated is unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, which is kind of a hotbed anyhow, and he doesn't really want it, and a few of the northern parts. But it's an untenable situation because there is no land link between the Gaza area and the other parts of the West Bank around Jericho and so forth. I think we're going to have a tough time bringing that thing to pass, but I would like to let our Jewish friends work out their problems without me interfering with it. But I am frankly concerned that they will enter into an ill-advised peace that may well imperil their long-range security. And having worked over there, we had a TV station for many years in the border of Israel, and I've been there, I don't know, 16, 17 times or however many, and we have a news bureau in Jerusalem. I'm quite concerned about the security situation, and Hamas, has not yet come on board. Hezbollah is probably better, or I shouldn't say more, is better organized than Al-Qaeda, supported by Iran, supported by Syria on the northern border of Israel, and also sending supplies down into the southern area. This situation is not over yet, and the Bible says pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and I certainly do that, but I'm quite concerned of an ill-advised peace under the pressure of the so-called quartet.
And one more difficult ethical question. It says, we Christians make an exception to thou shalt not kill in wartime and self-defense, but isn't torture also justifiable when there's a threat to millions of innocent lives?
I tell you, I'm not up for Attorney General. You could ask that to the man that just got confirmed. That is an ethical question that I'm not sure I totally have the answer to. The Bible says thou shalt not commit murder, and it's never been felt that actions in battle are murder, and I think we need to understand that, and I don't think evangelical Christians are pacifists. I think that there are times that there has to be a police force, and police have to take action against rogues, criminals, kidnappers, murderers, to bring them to justice. So without question. Now, what about torture? If you know that a man has the knowledge of a nuclear bomb that has been planted in the center of Washington that will detonate in an hour, and he can tell you where it is so you can defuse it, you tell me what you'd like to do. I think we might understand under those circumstances anything could happen to bring a little bit of knowledge out of that gentleman might be in order. But that's a question that at this point it looks like we shrink back from torture, and I believe that the United States is not a country that wants to engage in torture.
Before I ask the final question, I'd like to make a brief presentation. First, we have a certificate of appreciation for your appearance today.
Thank you. It's beautiful.
And the coveted National Press Club mug, which is useful even if you don't drink anything alcoholic.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now our final question of the afternoon. Are you getting a fair deal from the media?
The nice thing is when you've got your own media, it makes it a little easier. I know I was doing a story down in El Salvador during the height of the rebel insurgency against the government, and I was in San Salvador just a few days before Christmas. And behind me was a guy in a red suit with a beard, and he was ringing a bell, and he was saying Feliz Navidad, and shops were full of goods, and everybody was happy. Well, I had in my hand a copy of Newsweek magazine that said, in black and white, San Salvador will fall to the rebels before Christmas. And I had cameras there, and I had satellite or whatever I had, and I said, folks, it ain't going to happen. This country is not going to fall to communism. And then later, there was another thing, is a little map, and the little red dot on the map said, this is a great guerrilla stronghold. So we got a helicopter, and took my producer. I didn't go. I sent the producer up there. And he walked for hours, and he said, I didn't see any guerrillas anywhere. And I said, well, I think that's the story. There was an attempt to spin how bad certain of these countries were and how good the communists were. And when you have your own media there, you can bring a modicum of truth. But am I being treated well? After the November election, you cannot believe how nice people are to me. All right, thank you.
Great. Great. I'd like to thank all of you for coming today. I'd also like to thank National Press Club staff members Melinda Cook, Pat Nelson, Joanne Booz, and Howard Rothman for organizing today's lunch. And thanks, as always, to the NPC Library for their research. We're adjourned.